Here are the most famous prisoners who escaped from maximum security prisons. Number 10. Vasilis Paleokostas. Vasilis Paleokostas is one of the great escape artists of the 21st century. His exploits are legendary and have appeared in and influenced dozens of TV shows, films, and other media. Known as the Greek Robin Hood for giving out much of his ill-gotten gains to poor families throughout Greece, Paleokostas is a bank robber and kidnapper who was arrested for his kidnapping of a CEO in 1995 and was sentenced to 25 years in 2000. Paleokostas was incarcerated in the infamous maximum security prison Korydallos, which is known for its violence and security. And yet, Paleokostas has escaped from this maximum security prison not just once, but twice. In 2006, two accomplices booked a ride on a sightseeing helicopter in Athens. Once in the air, they hijacked it with explosives and a weapon and forced the pilot to fly to Korydallos prison. The guards were suspicious, but assumed that a helicopter landing must be official business and left it alone. Paleokostas just walked right on, was flown out, and it was hours before anyone realized he was gone. He was found after 2 years of evading the authorities and was brought back to Korydallos prison. Unbeknownst to authorities, Paleokostas had an accomplice on the outside who was taking helicopter lessons. On Sunday, the 22nd of February, 2009, this accomplice booked a helicopter and attached a rope ladder to it before flying over the prison. Guards were prepared this time and opened fire on the helicopter. Both the guards and the pilot exchanged high-caliber automatic fire while Paleokostas and his sidekick, Alket Rizai, grabbed onto the rope ladder and were flown to safety. Paleokostas has not been found since and remains as Greece's #1 most wanted fugitive. Number 9. Frank Abagnale. Frank Abagnale is quite possibly one of the most famous modern escape and con artists alive. If his name sounds familiar, it may be because of the film Catch Me If You Can, starring Tom Hanks and Leonardo DiCaprio, which is based on his life and criminal exploits. The real story is, as always, less glamorous than the screen, but still impressive nonetheless. The most important thing to remember about Abagnale is that he lied for a living for many years, and in many ways still does so. Throughout his teen years, he was in and out of prison for numerous counts of fraud and deception. He faked being a police officer and a customs official, and stole a car and financed his way across America with blank checks stolen from a family business. He would be arrested by the FBI for this crime, which began a long and complex relationship between Abagnale and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He famously impersonated an airline pilot and made his way upwards through society for a time before being caught out and arrested again. This time, he fled to Europe, where he continued defrauding people and conning his way along. He spent time in prisons in France and in Sweden before being deported back to the States. He was picked up in Cobb County after the FBI caught him using a forged Pan Am Airlines paycheck, though he then escaped from the Cobb County jail and went on the run. Despite many journalists claiming evidence that practically none of what Abagnale claims to have done was true, he is still a security advisor to numerous banks and has reportedly worked for the FBI, though that claim too is likely false. Abagnale is surrounded with so much smoke and mirrors, it's hard to know if anything is true at all. Number 8. El Chapo. Joaquin Guzman, better known as El Chapo, was one of the most powerful and influential drug lords and kingpins in the world. As one of the heads of the international Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo oversaw operations dealing a dozen different substances and also participating in arms trafficking and executions. He rose to prominence for his use of long-range tunnels under the Mexican-American border and was able to smuggle more narcotics than any drug lord before him. The DEA considered him a match to the influence and wealth of Pablo Escobar. His first capture came in 1993 in Guatemala, where he was extradited to Mexico and would be sentenced to 20 years in prison. He would escape in 2001 after bribing the guards for a total of $2.5 million, and he would stay free for 13 years until his second arrest in 2014, after arrested bodyguards gave information which led authorities to his hideout. His second escape would make use of the very tactic that earned him so much infamy in the first place. A mile-long tunnel was dug beneath the prison, equipped with air ventilation and high-quality building materials, as well as a motorcycle likely used by Guzman to escape. Number 7. Stephen J. Russell. Stephen Russell was born on New Year's Eve 1957 and was almost immediately put up for adoption. He was raised by a loving family, but his loss of his birth parents weighed heavily on him. He met and married Debbie Davis in 1976 and had a daughter with her, but after realizing he was gay, they divorced amicably. After his adoptive father passed and Russell's place of work found out about his sexuality and fired him for it, Russell had little incentive to find an honest living and in his rage decided to break bad dad and become a con artist. Russell started by selling fake Rolex watches and defrauded an insurance company for the modern equivalent of $85,000 by faking a fall. It wasn't until he tried to forge a passport that he was first arrested. Russell was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison soon after he found out his boyfriend, James Kemple, had HIV. Being locked behind bars while the love of his life rotted away didn't sit well with Russell, and so he decided to escape. He obtained street clothes and a guard's radio and casually walked out of the prison pretending to be an undercover cop. He and Kemple went on the run until Kemple's deteriorating condition forced them to return to the US to get treatment. Russell went on defrauding companies until he was caught again, but that wouldn't be the end. Russell would escape from prison another 3 times. After his final escape, he was recaptured but faked a heart attack, and while in the hospital called the hospital impersonating the FBI to set him free. Russell was sentenced to 144 years in prison and has spent all his time in solitary confinement. Number 6. Redouane Faïd. Redouane Faïd, also known as the King of Kalashnikovs, is a French-Algerian escape artist and gang leader who was first arrested in 1997 for being the ringleader of a series of armed robberies, jewel thefts, and extortions throughout the 90s. He was released on parole after serving only 10 years of his 30-year sentence, but was caught again after breaking parole conditions in 2011. Sentenced to another 8 years in prison, Faïd decided that he couldn't afford to serve the full sentence, and so, with the help of gang members on the outside, Faïd escaped in 2013. He broke out using explosives to blow 5 doors and holding 4 prison wardens hostage before using a getaway car to escape. Faïd was found and arrested a little over a month later while trying to forge documents to get to Israel. Arrested again, Faïd had no intention of staying in prison, and though it would be some time before his plan would come to fruition, he spent all his time working towards it. In 2018, 3 of his accomplices attended a helicopter flight school where they kidnapped the pilot instructor and hijacked the helicopter. Using high-caliber automatic weapons, the 3 accomplices stormed the prison and used an angle grinder to cut Faïd free before walking him to the helicopter. None were injured in the escape, and Faïd would go on the run for 4 more months before a nationwide manhunt of 3,000 or more officers found him and brought him to justice. Number 5. Jacques Mezrine. Jacques Mezrine was an unruly and delinquent child. In 1956, he was drafted into the French army and became a parachutist and commando during the war in Algeria, and was decorated with the Cross for Military Valor for his actions. Mezrine excelled in war purely for his love of violence and death. He left the army in '59 and almost immediately joined a far-right extremist group bent on preventing Algerian independence. He continued living a life of crime for many years until his first arrest, which sentenced him to 18 months in prison for robbery. After getting out, Mezrine made an effort to go clean, but after being fired during downsizing, he would return to his criminal ways. Mezrine would be arrested for a murder in Quebec and would escape a few weeks after his arrest, but would be caught the next day. A few years later, Mezrine and 5 other inmates would cut the fence wires of the Quebecois prison and run to freedom once more, even returning armed later, trying to release more inmates. Mezrine then returned to France and returned to robbing banks. However, within months he was imprisoned at the maximum security prison La Santé. Mezrine and 2 other accomplices would manage to escape after smuggling in weapons and a grappling hook. They were the first to ever escape La Santé. Following months of being hunted by a specialist task force, Mezrine's life was ultimately ended after a police ambush caught him completely by surprise. He fell in a hail of lead. Number 4. Richard Lee McNair. McNair was first arrested after a robbery gone wrong. He was trying to rob a farm when he was surprised by 2 men. McNair shot both, though only one was fatal, and went on the run briefly. When police brought him in, he surrendered a concealed weapon and was arrested for the murder. Shortly after being arrested, McNair was left handcuffed to a chair while investigators convened. Using lip balm as lubricant, he escaped from the cuffs and led police on a 2-hour foot chase before he was captured after leaping from a 3rd-story roof into a tree in an attempt to escape. In '92, 4 years after his first escape, McNair and 2 accomplices escaped the prison by crawling through the ventilation ducts. McNair would run free for 10 months before finally being arrested again and transferred to the maximum security Florence High. McNair would make his final escape after fashioning an escape pod complete with breathing tube and hiding in the mail cart under piles of bags of mail. The pallet was shrink-wrapped and forklifted to a warehouse outside the prison, where McNair then cut his way out and ran to freedom. McNair would finally be caught in New Brunswick, of all places. Number 3. Pascal Payette. Following a career of petty crime, Pascal Payette would be arrested for the murder of a French security guard during an armed robbery of an armored car. In 2001, he escaped from prison after an accomplice hijacked a helicopter and flew him to freedom. However, just a week later, his accomplice was arrested, and not long after that, Payette was recaptured. But Payette is nothing if not determined. In 2003, he arranged another helicopter escape with 3 other inmates. The initial escape was a success, and again Payette escaped prison on a helicopter. And again, Payette couldn't make it stick, being recaptured and arrested 3 weeks later. He was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment for murder and would be transferred 9 times in 30 months to prevent him organizing another. He was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment for murder and would be transferred 9 times in 30 months to prevent him from organizing another helicopter escape. In 2007, despite being the most heavily surveilled inmate in France, Payette took advantage of the Bastille Day celebrations to again, you guessed it, escape from prison in a helicopter. Payette seemed to be gifted in his escaping ability, but severely lacking in his staying free ability. Within 3 months, Payette was recaptured and moved to a top-secret, maximum security location. He holds the world record for most helicopter escapes planned by a single person. Number 2. Willie Sutton. Sutton was massively notorious amongst law enforcement for his escape artistry and bank robbing ability, but was universally loved by the underworld for his intelligence and skill. Incarcerated mafia members at the time would remark that he was so good at robbing banks, he made Jesse James and John Dillinger look like amateurs. In 1931, he was captured and sentenced to 30 years prison time for his robberies. However, he would only serve a little over a year of that sentence, escaping in 1932 using a smuggled weapon to hold a guard hostage. In 1934, he was caught again after another string of robberies and would stay incarcerated until 1945, when he would escape using a tunnel along with 12 other inmates. Sadly, they got out almost right in front of a police patrol, and despite running, they were all reapprehended. In 1947, Sutton would again escape, this time dressed as a prison guard, leaving in the dark of night. He managed 5 years of freedom before an amateur civilian detective gave police a tip on finding him. He would stay in prison until his health deteriorated to the point he was no longer considered a threat. He lived out his last days in freedom. Number 1. Zdzisław Namrodzki. At the age of 20, after getting into an intoxicated brawl with a police officer, Namrodzki was imprisoned for a year and a half. While being transported by train for his trial in Warsaw, he convinced the guards transporting him to uncuff him and join him for some drinks. After the guards fell asleep, Zdzisław leapt out the window and ran back to his home of Gliwice and freedom. He was contacted by a smuggler and was hired to cause distractions for the police to allow smuggled goods to transit freely in and out of Poland. Namrodzki also began robbing dozens of high-end stores and selling the goods on the black market. He was arrested again in 1980, but managed to escape by smuggling a blueprint of the jail and trial house, which allowed accomplices to saw apart the bars in one room, which he again escaped through. Namrodzki would escape from the authorities a total of 29 times, and would meet his end while recklessly driving a stolen car.